Welcome to my Learning Path 6. My view on how people learn is based on what values and beliefs people hold dear, which will then dictate how they learn. By this I mean, for instance, if one takes preconceived notions of how the world operates and how knowledge is acquired, then learning becomes difficult, if not impossible, when new phenomena or results in opposition to preconceived notions are encountered. A sometimes useful analogy I use in how people learn relates to my academic field of history. Conscripts fight because they are forced. Mercenaries fight because they're paid. Volunteers fight because they believe. In an educational context, I would put it like this. Conscripts learn because the legal system forces them. Mercenaries learn because they want economic benefits in the future. Volunteers learn because they are engaged. What is also important in my analogy here is that achievement to an arbitrary institutional standard isn't part of how people learn. It's a state-created measurement of the effect of approved standards and intervention methods. In any area of human discourse and knowledge, there will always be a spread amongst these three categories. For example, I have had no interest whatsoever in welding. If I were to have forced to take welding courses when I was in high school, I simply would have not done very well. In fact, I would have had a very low grade level achievement. As a counterpoint, I took history, social studies, economic courses in high school and excelled. At the time of my high school years, I'm dating myself, 1991 to 1994, I was only required to take one of these courses at the grade 12 level. In effect, what I find is that whatever curriculum is being delivered, there will always be a differentiation in the engagement levels of the participants depending on the context of the course. One may find few volunteers in certain situations, and in others, many mercenaries looking for a perceived reward. I found throughout this course that the Universal by Design model attempts to address this differentiation in learner engagements that, in my experience, our educational system refuses to acknowledge. I find it a truism that not all learners can be engaged in every learning process. In my view, the educational system assumes all learners are volunteers, and that is a fatal flaw. Plato said, "Ignorance is the root and stem of every evil." The reason that I mention this quote is that as a democratic and increasingly technologically sophisticated society, education is a critical component to maintaining our way of life. When the education system makes wide assumptions about the acquisition of knowledge, it concerns all of us. The generalized assumption of our educational system that everyone is a willing volunteer in the learning process, I postulate, is born of a political belief in the power of the state or an institution to effect large-scale societal changes. This is a take on the work by James C. Scott in his book, Seeing Like a State. He argues that social engineering by the state and, into the 20th century, by appendages of state institutions and corporations, fails to take into account the role of local knowledge and context that form the basis of informal practices and improvisations that allow societies and institutions to function. The inability of states to codify these practices ultimately dooms their ventures to failure. In his book, Scott examines these practices through two primary historical case studies in the 20th century, Soviet collectivization and villagization in Tanzania. Both these examples see authoritarian governments bound by dreams of social utopia fail in their social engineering projects to the mortal detriment of their populations. I postulate that when as an educational system, the belief that every learner is a volunteer, the same danger of statism may occur. It is not politically acceptable within the construct of an organizational system underpinned by statism to admit that interactions of individuals can be out of the control and regulation of the organization. This limitation to coercion and ability to effect change for the achievement of the defined goals of the state is not politically acceptable. A statist mindset, I believe, filters into the dominant institutions of our society, such as education. To acknowledge that learners' motivations cannot be controlled by the state through provided means of intervention is a threat to the system of control. What is key to consider? How does a state or institution offer the provided means of control and coercion, and what are these controls based on? Often, this means the intervention offered by educational institutions on current pedagogical issues espoused by what I term the professional development educational industrial complex, a conflagration of theorists, pundits, and entrepreneurs offering solutions to perceived weaknesses in institutionally provided interventions. I suspect that many of these offered solutions are not scientifically validated through rigorous experimentation and peer assessment, as the financial costs may be high and many solutions may be found fraudulent or applicable in only a small subset of specialized situations. That would be a most interesting research project, wouldn't it? To what extent have educational processes and intervention strategies been scientifically validated? But I digress. Given my view on the potential lack of valid experimental proof accompanying many educational interventions and improvement policies, with the potential inherent nature of educational institutions to adopt statism as a worldview, I've attempted to adapt the Universal by Design model to provide data from the curriculum to inform each of the three design phases. As evidence of this, I expanded the scope of rubrics to include all aspects of the outcomes, including knowledge and understanding, values, and attitudes outcomes. As well, I've developed my electronic planning document to enable the gathering of data to inform the design process. In this presentation, I'll elaborate on the usefulness of my model and the modifications I made. Helping me plan my unit of instruction. Having the curriculum central to the design process allowed me to track and align all three components of the design model. So from each of these three processes, we begin with our identifying desired results. In the established goal in social studies, as my example, was from 10-1. To what extent should we embrace globalization? The model then asks two key questions. What are the essential questions considered, and what understandings are desired? This allowed me to identify the related issue. To what extent does globalization contribute to sustainable prosperity for all people? And what's the understandings that are desired? Well, the general outcome. Students will assess economic, environmental, and other contemporary impacts of globalization. The model then asks, what key knowledge and skills will students acquire as a result of this unit? That is where we relate the knowledge and understanding outcomes from the curriculum, from 3.3 to 3.9. These are the core understandings that students will need to know from the curriculum. As well, the modified model asks, students will be able to do what in addition? And that's where the values and attitudes outcomes come, from 3.1 to 3.2. At the bottom here we have strands of the social studies which form the basis for the learning outcomes. These are integrated throughout the curriculum as we see here in parentheses behind each one. Using my modified by design model allowed me to explore the curriculum in a greater understanding and to a greater extent than I had before, to identify students, their learning, and looking at our next term of looking at evidence. And evidence, using my adapted model, looked at here on the left assessment methods, where we have our traditional quizzes on our outside circle. We have more traditional selected response, constructed responses, our inner circle, and our primary assessments dealing with complex and open-ended non-authentic projects. So comparing that to what I had done, I used a multiple choice test looking at the Sentio response system using the smartboard. That's where we have traditional multiple choice tests done on the computer, which allows us to look at the responses instantaneously. We get a good range of analytics from the student level to the classroom and finally to all the courses being done by that teacher looking at the curriculum. Our next circle here, important to know and do, is where I looked at position paper response. As an example of part of my learning plan and learning task 5, I looked at the introduction to a position paper, a guide and an introduction assignment on how to write involving formative and summative steps. Finally, the third learning task I used as an example was a course project concerning a simulation of the world economy. That was a complex, open-ended, authentic task. It was based on scaling down the world economy to the classroom and have students go through the simulation to learn what it was like to operate in the actual world economy. In regards to further evidence, I also involved rubric development. All rubrics were based on the diploma exam rubrics set by the province and scaled down for grade 11 and down to grade 10, which I used as my example. The modification I made through my design process was to include the values and outcomes here and the skills and processes located here on each of the rubrics, so that even if we're looking at a position paper in Unit 3, what skills, process, and values and outcomes were involved in that. That brings us to the second one, is the position paper as well. These two form the basis of the rubrics and assessment for grade 10. Our third step is our learning plan. I use this planning document used. So we have our units and our lessons here, we have our curricular outcomes, and we have all of the information to make sense of our chart here. This was a very valuable process that allowed me to see what elements of the curriculum were being covered, what benchmark skills, and what were the primary assessment techniques, and did I have a good mix between my instructional strategies and what was I properly incorporating formative and summative assessments within my model. In looking at if I had to make any changes to my modified universal by design model, I didn't have to make any significant changes. I did, however, have to adapt my learning plan and the role of evidence. What I have here are two smartboard presentations that I had to adapt. Now the first one here on the left is one that I had from a previous year, Social Studies 10-1, Unit 3, and the first quiz. On the right here is the one that I adapted after going through the design process of Social Studies 10-1 related issue 3. To begin with, on the left here, I had done it in the standard format with my text and with my answers. So I'll compare that to my modified on the right here. Much more graphical, and I incorporated the yellow to draw the student's attention to the answers. And the second question, again, a nice graphic and in big bold print versus how I had done it previously with the text, nothing to draw your eye in. Our third question, same thing, based solely on a recall type question versus, again, our source, which is more of what the curriculum wants to see students do, apply their knowledge in a critical thinking fashion. And our last question, here we have a source, and again in the yellow to draw the reader's attention, versus what we have over here, another recall type of question. So this is just one form of the adaptations I did with my model. The second is dealing with the learning plan, which I'll show here with these two documents on how to write an essay, and in social studies case, a position paper. On the right here is the guide that I had scaled down from the grade 12 diploma exam position paper model. I incorporated the to what extent perspective here, the scoring, the structure, and for the grade 10s, what the key course goals are, globalization, and our three big components of that. How to write their response, and conclusion with a copy of the rubric. On the left here is a formative assignment that, when looking at my learning plan, I was deficient in doing in previous years. I had not had the students work through the start of the paper, the middle, and the end. So this is an example of working through the start of the paper. An introduction for the written response. The students here, in each of the blank spaces, put briefly down in point form each related part of the introduction. On the back here, we have a rubric and a space for them to write the response. This will be graded formatively. So these are two examples in two of the stages of my modified by design model where I had to make some adaptations.